A silent city of stone stands on a windswept border. This is Ani, a ghost city whose ruins are the only testament to a world we have nearly forgotten. But these broken walls and empty churches are not just the remains of one lost kingdom. They are a key, a physical key, to unlocking the story of an entire medieval crossroads. For centuries, this was a place where empires met, where faiths crossed paths, and where goods and ideas from across continents were exchanged. The story of Ani challenges every simple tale of isolated cultures and clashing civilizations. It reveals instead the deeply interconnected, complex nature of the medieval world. By the end of this exploration, you will see history not as a series of separate chapters, but as a woven tapestry with Ani at its vital center. We will piece together what the stones themselves tell us about this pivotal nexus. How did a single city become a melting pot for Armenian kings, Georgian generals, Seljuk sultans, and Silk Road merchants? And what does its silent, layered legacy say about our own understanding of the past? What do you believe is the true mark a civilization leaves behind? Its name was a promise of splendor, the city of 1,001 churches. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Ani was not merely a capital, it was a statement carved in stone. As the heart of the Bagratid Armenian kingdom, the city represented a golden age of political power, architectural ambition, and spiritual devotion. But to understand its true nature, you must first look at the land itself. Ani was built on a triangular plateau of sheer volcanic rock, a natural fortress surrounded on three sides by a deep ravine carved by the Akhurian River. This was not a location chosen for scenic beauty alone. It was a deliberate, strategic masterstroke. This formidable plateau sat directly upon a vital branch of the Silk Road, the ancient network of trade routes connecting continents. From this high perch, the rulers of Ani controlled the flow of goods, people, and ideas moving between the Byzantine Empire to the west, the Persian and Islamic realms to the south and east, and the diverse kingdoms of the Caucasus to the north. Every caravan that passed through its gates paid tolls, every merchant brought news, and every traveler carried with them a piece of a distant world. So while the epithet city of 1,001 churches speaks to its spiritual grandeur, it was this geography that made such grandeur possible. The wealth flowing from that trade funded the construction of those magnificent churches, palaces, and walls, transforming a rocky outcrop into a metropolis that rivaled Constantinople and Baghdad in its cosmopolitan flair. Ani was born from its position at the crossroads, a hub designed to connect, not to isolate. Yet that strategic brilliance is precisely what makes its ruins so uniquely eloquent. The stones of Ani are far more than rubble. They are a stratified architectural record, a physical timeline stacked one layer upon another. When you walk through the silent streets today, you are not looking at the remains of a single culture or a single moment in time. You are reading a story written in brick, in carved stone, and in the very layout of the city itself. The key to understanding this forgotten crossroads lies not in a history book first, but in the ground beneath your feet and the walls that still stand against the sky. Different building styles and construction techniques sit side by side, sometimes even fused together in a single structure, each telling a chapter in the saga of who held power, who brought new ideas, and how these cultures interacted. This architectural time capsule preserves the evidence of successive rulers and the flow of influences across centuries. In the looming arches of the cathedral, you see one vision of faith and authority. In the intricate stonework of the Church of St. Gregory, you encounter another. The elegant minaret of the Mosque of Manuchihr introduces a completely different architectural language, while the massive, zigzagging city walls tell a separate story of defense and adaptation. Each of these surviving structures is a character in this narrative, holding clues about the people who built them and the world they inhabited. To truly hear what the ruins of Ani reveal, we must learn to listen to these stones. The most profound voice among the silent stones belongs to the cathedral. Completed in the year 1001, it was the crowning achievement of the architect Trdat, and it stands as a declaration of both faith and genius. Its design was revolutionary not for its size but for its daring engineering. Trdat employed pointed arches and ribbed vaulting, a structural system that distributes weight with incredible efficiency, allowing for taller walls and larger windows. This was not merely a beautiful choice, it was a brilliant one. These very same architectural principles would become the defining features of Gothic cathedrals in Western Europe, but they would not appear there for another 150 years. At Ani, at the crossroads of continents, a master builder had already solved the puzzle. This tells us something vital about the Bagratid kingdom. It was not a remote outpost clinging to tradition, but a sophisticated, innovative center of learning and technical skill, fully engaged with the architectural conversations of the wider medieval world. The cathedral was more than a church. It was the spiritual and ceremonial heart of the Christian kingdom, the stage for royal coronations and sacred rites. Its prominent location within the city walls sent a clear message of power to every traveler approaching from the Silk Road. Here was a civilization confident in its identity, capable of creating monuments that could rival any in Constantinople or Baghdad, yet doing so with a distinctive artistic vision all its own. The cathedral's enduring skeleton, even in ruin, is a testament to that vision, proving that the crossroads was not just a place of exchange, but a forge for original ideas. But the narrative of the stones takes a fascinating turn just a short walk from the cathedral. Rising from the edge of the cliff is the Mosque of Manuchihr, a structure that speaks a different architectural language yet tells a deeply connected story. Built after the Seljuk Turkish conquest of Ani in the 11th century, it is recognized as one of the very first Turkish mosques in Anatolia, yet it does not look entirely like what you might expect. Its most striking feature is its tall, cylindrical minaret, which bears a remarkable resemblance not to typical Islamic minarets of the era, but to the bell towers found on Armenian churches. This is not a coincidence or an accident of history. It is a deliberate architectural choice that holds a profound secret. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests the mosque itself was constructed directly upon the foundations of an earlier Armenian structure, likely a palace or hall from the Bagratid period. This single building, therefore, is a physical palimpsest, a literal layering of two worlds. What does this hybrid form reveal? It tells a story far more nuanced than simple conquest and erasure. The Seljuk builders, new rulers of a cosmopolitan city, made a pragmatic and symbolic decision. By building upon existing, revered foundations and incorporating familiar local architectural motifs into the minaret, they signaled continuity. They were adapting a sacred space for a new faith, while acknowledging the skilled craftsmanship and spiritual gravity of the place they now governed. This was not an attempt to wipe the slate clean, but to write a new chapter on top of an old one, creating a dialogue in stone between the conquering and conquered cultures. The mosque stands as powerful evidence that at this crossroads, cultural exchange and adaptation were often more powerful forces than outright destruction. Another masterpiece of stone stands not far away, the Church of the Holy Redeemer. Its story is one of breathtaking precision followed by profound loss, a microcosm of Ani's own journey. Commissioned by Prince Abulgarib Polavid in the 11th century, it was built for a singular, sacred purpose, to house a fragment of the true cross, the most revered relic in the Christian world. Securing such a treasure was an act of immense piety and staggering political influence, a clear sign that the elite of Ani moved in the highest circles of faith and power. But the church built to hold this relic was itself a marvel. Its design was a feat of geometry, a 19-sided polygonal structure of such mathematical perfection that it seemed to defy the very nature of stone. Each facet, each arch was calculated to create a harmonious whole, a testament to the advanced understanding of its architects. This was not just a place of worship, it was a statement in sandstone, proclaiming that wealth and devotion could harness the laws of nature to glorify the divine. The Church of the Holy Redeemer represented the absolute zenith of Ani's confidence, where faith, science, and art converged in a single, perfect form. Yet its fate would come to mirror the city's own vulnerability. Centuries after its construction, the church was struck by a lightning bolt that split the structure cleanly in two, as if cut by a giant blade. One half of the mathematically perfect building collapsed into rubble, while the other half remained standing, a stark and haunting silhouette against the sky. This dramatic event feels less like an accident of weather and more like a powerful symbol. Here was a monument to human precision and spiritual ambition, rendered fragile by a force of nature, its divided form a silent echo of the fractures that would eventually run through the entire crossroads. The remaining half still stands today, a poignant monument to both what was achieved and what was lost, a permanent reminder that even the most perfect designs are subject to the unpredictable currents of history. The story of faith at Ani, however, was never just a royal or state project. A short distance from the great cathedral, a smaller but no less magnificent church offers a different, more personal perspective. This is the Church of Saint Gregory of Tigran Honents, a structure that tells a powerful story of private wealth, artistic fusion, and the enduring vitality of the crossroads even as political flags changed hands. It was built in the early 13th century during a period when the Georgian kingdom, under the legendary Queen Tamar, exerted control over the region. But its builder was not a Georgian king or general. He was Tigran Honents, an immensely wealthy Armenian merchant. His decision to fund this elaborate church with his own fortune is a revelation in itself. It tells us that even under a new political administration, Ani remained a thriving commercial hub where a merchant could amass such wealth and feel secure enough to invest it in a permanent, public monument to his faith and status. The city's lifeblood, its trade, clearly continued to flow. The church itself is a masterpiece of artistic synthesis. Architecturally, it blends the classic Armenian plan with distinct Georgian decorative elements, creating a hybrid style that feels both familiar and new. But its true glory lies within. The interior walls are covered with breathtaking frescoes, a rarity in Armenian church art of this period, which more often featured carved stone. These vibrant paintings depict scenes from the life of Christ and various saints, but their style is unmistakably influenced by the broader Byzantine artistic tradition. Here, in this privately funded chapel, we see the cosmopolitan taste of a merchant class that moved freely across cultural borders. Tigran Honents did not look only to local artisans. He likely brought in painters familiar with the latest styles from Constantinople or other major centers, blending their techniques with local architectural forms. The result is a space that feels both intimately Armenian and grandly connected to the wider Christian world. This church stands as a profound testament to a simple truth, that culture and commerce often travel on separate roads from political power. While sovereignty over Ani had shifted from Armenian kings to Georgian rulers, the city's fundamental identity as a crossroads persisted. A wealthy merchant could navigate this new reality, using his economic influence to create a lasting spiritual and artistic legacy. The Church of Saint Gregory reveals that the true engine of Ani's cultural richness was not solely royal decrees, but the everyday interactions of its diverse inhabitants, the flow of goods, and the private ambitions of its citizens. It proves that even in an era of political change, the deep currents of exchange and adaptation that defined this place never truly ceased. The stones here speak not of conquest, but of continuity through creativity. While merchants and princes built monuments of faith, the very survival of their city rested upon a far more brutal form of engineering. Encircling the entire plateau of Ani is a system of walls so vast, so complex, that they form a city within themselves. These were not simple barriers, but a masterpiece of medieval military architecture, a double line of towering ramparts punctuated by dozens of massive, semi-circular bastions. Their scale is almost incomprehensible, a continuous stone serpent coiling around the cliffs, designed to make the city impregnable. The primary wall, built by King Esembat II in the late 10th century, was a statement in stone and mortar. It stood up to 8 meters high and was thick enough to withstand the siege engines of the age. But the true genius lay in the details. The walls followed the natural contours of the treacherous terrain, using the cliffs themselves as foundational elements. The bastions, placed at strategic intervals, provided overlapping fields of fire for defenders, allowing them to rain arrows or other projectiles down on any force attempting to scale the slopes. And then there were the gates, the controlled entry points where all traffic from the Silk Road had to pass. The most famous of these was the Lion Gate, named for the majestic stone lion that once adorned its facade, a symbol of royal power and ferocity guarding the primary southern entrance. Passing through this gate was a calculated experience, a funnel that forced caravans and armies alike into a vulnerable, controlled space where they could be observed, taxed, or stopped. These walls tell us one thing with absolute clarity: the wealth and brilliance of Ani existed in a state of perpetual, looming threat. The Bagratid kings knew their city was a prize, and they invested a staggering portion of their kingdom's resources not just in beauty, but in sheer, overwhelming defense. The walls were a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, meant to deter ambition through their obvious strength. Yet, the cold historical truth provides a haunting counterpoint to their formidable appearance. Despite this incredible investment, Ani was captured not once but multiple times. It fell to the Byzantine Empire, then to the Seljuk Turks, and later to others. This stark contrast between the wall's intended purpose and the city's fate reveals a deeper, more unsettling truth about life at the crossroads. No amount of stone, no matter how brilliantly engineered, could ultimately defend against the shifting tides of empires, the vast movements of armies, or the complex webs of alliance and betrayal that defined the region. The walls stand today not as a testament to invincibility, but to the profound vulnerability that comes with being a center of wealth and influence. They are the embodiment of a civilization's hope for permanence, locked in a silent, stone dialogue with the forces of change that eventually swept through its gates. But the story of Ani is not only written on the cliffs and in the open air. To truly understand the city's full character, you must look down into the earth itself. The same soft volcanic tuff that made the plateau a perfect canvas for grand architecture also held a secret, a hidden world carved directly into the rock beneath the streets. Beyond the walls and churches, a vast, lesser-known network of tunnels, caves, and entire underground chambers winds through the darkness. This subterranean labyrinth reveals a city that thought in 3 dimensions, preparing for every facet of human existence. While the soaring cathedrals reached for the heavens, these hand-carved spaces addressed more earthly and often urgent needs. Archaeologists and historians hypothesize these chambers served a multitude of interconnected purposes. Some were almost certainly used for storage, keeping valuable trade goods or vital food supplies safe and at a stable temperature. Others show evidence of being used as monastic cells, places for quiet retreat and spiritual contemplation far from the bustle of the surface markets. The most compelling theory, however, points to survival. During the frequent sieges that marked Ani's history, these tunnels would have provided crucial refuge for the city's population. When gates were breached and walls scaled, the people could have vanished into this hidden underworld, waiting out the storm in relative safety. Some passages may have even functioned as secret routes, allowing messengers to move unseen or for supplies to be smuggled in during a blockade. This vertical expansion of the city speaks volumes about the mindset of its inhabitants. It shows a community that was both deeply pious and intensely pragmatic. They built magnificent churches to nurture their souls and ensure their legacy, but they also invested immense collective labor into carving out spaces for physical preservation. The underground city was a direct response to the constant reality of threat, a silent insurance policy written in stone. It transforms our image of Ani from a two-dimensional map of splendid buildings into a living, breathing organism with deep roots. Life here extended from the highest spire down to the deepest cellar, a complete ecosystem of faith, commerce, and resilience. This hidden layer proves that the city's brilliance was not just in what it displayed to the world, but in what it kept concealed, a private dimension of preparation and perseverance that ensured its community could endure. Above the hidden tunnels and below the soaring churches, the true pulse of the city could be felt in its open spaces. The Great Bazaar of Ani was not merely a market, it was the living, breathing engine of the crossroads, a place where geography became commerce and commerce became culture. While the grand stone monuments have survived the centuries, the vibrant wooden stalls and colorful awnings of the marketplace are long gone, vanished into dust. Yet the ground itself has not forgotten. Archaeologists sifting through the soil of the city's central districts have unearthed a silent but eloquent testimony to a world of relentless exchange. The most common finds are coins, thousands of them, minted not just by Armenian kings but by Byzantine emperors, Seljuk sultans, and Georgian monarchs. This mixed currency tells a simple, powerful story. In the bazaars of Ani, a merchant from Constantinople could bargain with a trader from Baghdad using coins from 3 different empires, and the transaction would be understood by all. Money here was fluid, a universal language of value that transcended political borders the moment one passed through the city gates, but the coins are only the beginning. Scattered among the foundations of merchant quarters and the remains of caravanserais, the inns that house traveling traders and their animals are fragments of a much larger story. Pieces of fine Chinese porcelain, glazed in celadon green, have been discovered alongside intricately painted Persian pottery. Shards of glassware from Syria and Egypt lie next to locally produced clay vessels. These broken pieces, once part of luxurious cups, plates, and flasks, reveal the astonishing range of goods that flowed through this hub. Silk from the Far East, spices from India, incense from Arabia, and furs from the northern steppes would have all changed hands in these crowded lanes. The archaeological record shows that Ani was not just a passive stop on a long route. It was a dynamic consumption center. The city's own elite, its wealthy merchants and nobles, had the means and the taste to acquire the finest luxuries the connected world could offer. Their tables were set with a global pantry, their homes adorned with objects from across the known world. This constant flow of goods necessitated a constant flow of people. The caravanserais, with their sturdy walls and secure courtyards, would have been a cacophony of languages. Armenian, Greek, Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and Georgian dialects all mingled in the air alongside the sounds of haggling, the braying of pack animals, and the clatter of goods being unloaded. In these spaces, a deal was more than a trade. It was an act of translation and trust. A Georgian metalsmith might learn a new alloy technique from a Persian artisan. A Byzantine scholar traveling with a merchant caravan might share a philosophical text with an Armenian monk. The bazaar was the ultimate melting pot, where every transaction carried with it a sliver of news, a fragment of a song, or a new way of thinking. The very layout of the city supports this, with wide, straight thoroughfares designed not for defense, but for the efficient movement of carts and camels laden with merchandise. What emerges from these scattered coins and ceramic shards is the portrait of a city whose identity was fundamentally commercial. Its magnificent walls provided security for trade, its grand churches offered spiritual solace to wealthy patrons, and its strategic position guaranteed a steady stream of customers. Ani thrived because it mastered the art of connection. It understood that a crossroads is not just a point on a map where roads meet. It is a space created by the people who travel them and the things they carry. The silent stones of the bazaar district, now empty under the open sky, once resonated with the vibrant hum of a truly cosmopolitan marketplace. It was here, amid the mundane chaos of commerce, that the medieval world felt most interconnected, proving that ideas often travel fastest when wrapped in the promise of profit. But the sacred geography of Ani extended far beyond its famous churches and the mosque. The ground beneath them whispers of even older, quieter devotions. Scattered across the site, archaeologists have identified the remains of what appear to be Zoroastrian fire temples, structures predating the Christian era. These simple, square foundations with central altars were once places where a flame was kept perpetually burning, a central practice of the ancient Persian faith that venerated the elements. Their presence tells us that long before the first cathedral spire pierced the sky, this strategic plateau was already a place of ritual and gathering, its spiritual significance recognized by a different civilization entirely. This layered spiritual history continued through the centuries. While definitive archaeological proof remains elusive, historical records and the patterns of trade strongly suggest the presence of a Jewish quarter within the bustling city. As a major Silk Road hub, Ani would have naturally attracted Jewish merchants and scholars, who often formed tight-knit communities in medieval trading centers from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. Their likely presence adds another vital thread to the city's complex social fabric, and the religious evolution did not stop with the Seljuk conquest. In later centuries, as Islamic governance became firmly established, new institutions arose to shape the city's spiritual and intellectual life. The foundations of several madrasas, or Islamic theological schools, have been identified among the ruins. These were not just places of prayer, but centers of advanced learning where scholars studied law, philosophy, medicine, and astronomy, often debating ideas that flowed in from across the Islamic world and beyond. This progression from fire temple to church, from suggested synagogue to mosque and madrasa, paints a profound portrait of Ani not as a monolithic religious capital, but as a true spiritual crossroads. It was a place where faiths did not merely pass by each other, but where they sequentially inhabited the same ground, each building upon the sacred memory of the last. This diversity suggests a reality where communities could, for long periods, coexist within the city's walls, their lives and rituals woven into the daily rhythm of the marketplace and the neighborhood. The sacred landscape was not static but dynamic, constantly being rewritten by new arrivals who nevertheless had to contend with the deep, accumulated gravity of the place itself. Here, a Zoroastrian might have once watched a sacred flame where a Christian later knelt in prayer, in a district where a Jewish trader might have lived and a Muslim student would one day ponder the stars. This is the ultimate revelation of the stones, that a crossroads is not defined by a single moment of meeting, but by the enduring, layered conversation between all who pause there. While coins and silks moved through the bustling markets, another, more precious form of currency was being minted in quiet rooms across the city. In the scriptoria of Ani, the true wealth of the crossroads was not measured in silver, but in ink and parchment. These dedicated writing rooms, often attached to monasteries or the libraries of noble households, were hubs of intense, meticulous activity. Here, scribes bent over their desks for hours, their quills scratching a steady rhythm as they copied sacred texts, historical chronicles, and works of philosophy. Nearby, illuminators worked with brushes finer than a single hair, mixing pigments from lapis lazuli, gold leaf, and crushed minerals to create breathtaking illustrations that danced in the margins of the pages. This was not mere reproduction, it was an act of creation and preservation, a sacred duty to safeguard knowledge itself. The very existence of such active scriptoria tells us that Ani was far more than a commercial or military hub. It was a thriving center of intellectual life. A city focused solely on trade would not invest such immense resources, time, and artistic talent into the painstaking craft of bookmaking. This required a wealthy, educated patron class, bishops, nobles, and merchants like Tigran Honents who valued learning and were willing to commission these exquisite, expensive objects. It also required a community of scholars, translators, and artists who could collaborate to produce them. The manuscripts that flowed from Ani's scriptoria were themselves crossroads. A single page might contain the Armenian translation of a Greek theological treatise, copied from a Byzantine manuscript brought by a merchant, its ornate borders decorated with motifs inspired by Persian or Islamic geometric art observed in the bazaar. In this way, the scriptorium became a node in a vast, invisible network, the medieval internet of its day. Ideas from Constantinople, Baghdad, and beyond were translated, adapted, and given a new home in the Armenian language and artistic tradition, ensuring their survival for future generations. This transmission of knowledge was perhaps the most enduring form of exchange the city facilitated. While a silk robe would eventually wear out and a spice would be consumed, a beautifully copied and illuminated manuscript could last for centuries, carrying its accumulated wisdom far beyond the city walls. The scribes of Ani, in their quiet dedication, were not just record keepers, they were active participants in the dialogue of civilizations, proving that at this cultural intersection, the most powerful cargo was often carried not on the backs of camels, but in the minds of its people and the pages of their books. The year 1064 marked a profound and permanent shift in the story of the crossroads. That year, the great Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan stood with his army before the legendary walls of Ani. For 25 days, the formidable defenses held, a testament to their brilliant engineering. But on the 26th day, a section of the wall, weakened by relentless siege engines or perhaps through a gate left treacherously unlocked, gave way. The Seljuk forces poured into the city. Contemporary chroniclers, their words heavy with the memory of loss, recorded that the city faced a period of great hardship. The event was not merely a change in administration, it was a seismic rupture, and the stones of Ani bear the scars of that moment to this day. In the layers of earth, archaeologists find a stark line of ash and charcoal, a silent stratum marking widespread fires that swept through districts during the capture. In certain areas, the elegant stonework of aristocratic homes lies in sudden, chaotic collapse, as if frozen in the instant of impact. This physical evidence aligns with the historical narrative of a violent transition, a conquest that shattered the political order which had built the city of 1001 churches. The golden age of the independent Bagratid Armenian kingdom was over, its capital now a prize of war. Yet, to read this event only as an ending is to miss the deeper story the ruins tell. For in the very same archaeological record, just above that layer of ash, a new story begins to be written in stone and mortar. The evidence of destruction is swiftly followed by signs of rebuilding, adaptation, and a new kind of life. The Mosque of Manuchihr, constructed upon older foundations, is the most powerful symbol of this new chapter, but it is not alone. Existing churches were not systematically torn down. Many were simply repurposed or continued to be used by the city's diminished Christian population. New caravanserais were built to service the still vital trade routes, and the city's infrastructure was repaired. This pattern reveals a crucial truth about Alp Arslan and the Seljuk vision. They had not come to erase Ani from the map, but to claim its strategic and economic power for themselves. The conquest was less about cultural annihilation and more about redirecting the flow of the crossroads into a new imperial system. The capture of Ani was the key that unlocked Anatolia. It marked the decisive beginning of large-scale Turkic settlement and political control in the region, setting in motion demographic and cultural transformations that would shape the future of the land for centuries to come. For Ani itself, this moment was the ultimate test of its identity. Could a city born as a Christian Armenian capital survive as a Muslim Turkic provincial center? The archaeological answer, written in the hybrid architecture and continued habitation, is a quiet yes. The conquest did not silence the crossroads, it simply changed the language of the conversation. The layered identity of Ani gained another profound stratum, one where the call to prayer now echoed off the same cliffs that once heard only church bells. This was not a replacement but a complex addition, a turning point where the city's enduring strategic value once again proved stronger than the symbols of any single ruler who held it. Yet even after the Seljuk conquest, the crossroads refused to settle into a single, simple story. A new political wind soon blew from the north, bringing with it a remarkable chapter often called the Georgian interlude. In the late 12th and 13th centuries, the powerful Georgian kingdom, under the legendary Queen Tama, expanded its influence deep into the region. Ani did not fall to a sudden siege this time, but was gradually integrated into a new sphere of control, administered by a dynasty of powerful Armenian generals known as the Zakarians. This era reveals something profound about the resilience of a place like Ani. It shows that the city's identity as a Christian cultural crossroads could not only survive, but actually flourish again, even under a political framework entirely different from its original Bagratid founders. The Zakarians, loyal vassals to the Georgian crown but ethnically Armenian, became the new patrons of the ancient city. Their first and most symbolic act was one of restoration. They embarked on a major campaign to repair the damage of previous conflicts, breathing new life into the very stones that defined Ani's soul. The great cathedral, that masterpiece of Trdat, was carefully restored. Its cracked walls were stabilized, its weathered carvings tended to, its sacred space reconsecrated for worship. This was far more than routine maintenance. It was a deliberate political and spiritual statement, a declaration that the legacy of the Armenian Christian kingdom was not forgotten, but was being actively reclaimed and woven into a new, powerful alliance. But the Zakarians did not stop with preservation. They also built anew, adding their own layer to the city's architectural story. They commissioned and fortified new sections of the defensive walls, strengthening the city's perimeter. More importantly, they sponsored the construction of new churches and chapels, like the exquisite church of Saint Gregory of Tigran Honents we explored earlier. These new structures blended the classic Armenian architectural plan with distinct Georgian decorative elements, creating a beautiful hybrid style. You can see it in the intricate stone carvings around windows and doorways, where traditional Armenian geometric patterns might intertwine with lush, vine-like scrolls more common in Georgian art of the period. This fusion in stone tells us that this was not a foreign occupation, but a complex partnership. The Zakarian governors were cultural bridge builders, seamlessly merging their Armenian heritage with the political reality of Georgian sovereignty. They proved that Christian culture at this crossroads was not a fragile relic, but a dynamic, adaptable force. The vitality of faith and artistic expression here was not dependent on a single, independent kingdom. It could thrive under a new protectorate, fueled by the wealth and security provided by the expansive Georgian Empire. This era lays bare the intricate alliances that defined the medieval Caucasus. It was a world where ethnicity, faith, and political loyalty were often separate threads, woven together by pragmatic rulers. Queen Tamar, a Christian monarch, empowered Armenian generals to rule a city that had been under Islamic control, all to secure a vital trade node and extend her influence. The continued construction of magnificent churches during this period sends a clear message. The deep currents of cultural and religious life at Ani, the very essence that made it a crossroads, could flow through many different political channels. The stones from this interlude whisper that the city's true power lay not in who held the keys to its gates, but in its enduring ability to inspire devotion and artistry across generations and shifting borders. A new and terrifying force was gathering on the eastern horizon. In the early 13th century, the Mongol Empire, under the leadership of commanders like Subutai and Jebe, began its relentless expansion westward. Their arrival at the gates of Ani, culminating in a final, devastating capture in the 1230s, did not represent just another change in rulers. It signaled the beginning of a slow, irreversible unraveling of the city's very reason for being. The archaeological record from this period is stark. Beneath the later layers of abandonment, researchers find a clear stratum of catastrophic destruction. Thick bands of ash, collapsed walls showing signs of intense fire, and a sudden, dramatic drop in the variety of luxury goods like imported ceramics and coin. This is the physical signature of the Mongol sack, a moment of concentrated violence that shattered the city's social and economic backbone. But the true tragedy for Ani was not merely the initial blow, which was severe, but the lasting aftershock that followed. The Mongols, brilliant strategists of conquest, operated on a different logic than the Seljuks or Georgians before them. Their goal was not to integrate and administer a prosperous trade hub, but to extract its wealth and break any potential for resistance. They dismantled the delicate systems of security and patronage that had allowed commerce to flourish. More critically, their conquests threw the entire Silk Road network into a prolonged period of instability and reorganization. The very trade routes that were Ani's lifeblood, the reason for its walls and its wealth, became dangerous and unpredictable. Caravans that once moved with relative assurance now faced new tolls, shifting bandit loyalties, and the constant threat of conflict between Mongol factions. The safe, regulated passage that had defined the crossroads for centuries was gone. You can see this economic death in the stones themselves. Following the Mongol period, the great age of monumental construction in Ani comes to an abrupt halt. No new cathedrals or mosques of significance rise from the plateau. No wealthy merchants commission frescoed private chapels. The grand caravanserais fall into disrepair, their courtyards silent. The city's elite, those patrons of art and architecture, either perished, fled, or saw their fortunes evaporate as trade dried up. Ani did not disappear overnight, but it began a long, slow fade into provincial obscurity. Its population dwindled, its buildings were quarried for stone, and its global connections withered. This final decline reveals the city's profound and fragile dependency. Ani was a brilliant creation of geography and human enterprise, but it could not exist in isolation. Its splendor was wholly contingent on the peaceful, predictable flow of goods and ideas across continents. When the wider network of Eurasian trade fractured, the city at its center could not sustain itself. The ruins, therefore, tell a dual story of resilience and vulnerability. They show us a community that could adapt to new rulers, new faiths, and new artistic styles over centuries. Yet they also stand as a solemn monument to a harsh historical truth, that even the most vibrant crossroads is ultimately at the mercy of the winds that blow through it. The slow fade from a global crossroads into a quiet provincial town might have continued for generations, but the earth itself delivered the final verdict. In the year 1319, a massive earthquake struck the region, its epicenter terrifyingly close to the already fragile city. This was not a tremor but a cataclysmic force that tore through the very foundations of Ani. For the city's magnificent but weary structures, it was a death blow. The great cathedral, which had survived sieges and changes of faith, now suffered a direct hit. Its iconic dome, that revolutionary feat of engineering by Trdat, collapsed inward, sending tons of stone crashing onto the sanctuary floor. The Church of the Holy Redeemer, already split perfectly in half by lightning, likely saw further sections of its precise geometry reduced to rubble. Towers along the mighty walls sheared off and tumbled into the ravine. Across the plateau, roofs caved in, walls that had stood for centuries pancaked into piles of carved stone, and fissures opened in the streets themselves. For the remaining inhabitants, this was an unimaginable catastrophe. Their homes, their places of worship, and the last symbols of their city's former grandeur were physically shattered in a few violent minutes. The earthquake of 1319 is more than a historical footnote. It is a clear, undeniable line in the archaeological record. When researchers dig through the layers of Ani, they encounter a chaotic stratum of destruction that is universal. It lies above the ash of fires and the evidence of decline, a definitive capstone of rubble. This layer tells a story of simultaneous, widespread collapse that could only be caused by a massive natural event, distinct from the localized damage of war or neglect. This natural disaster compounded centuries of man-made decline in the most final way possible. The city's economy was already a shadow of its former self, its population diminished and its political importance gone. After the quake, the cost and sheer effort of clearing such monumental ruins and rebuilding a functioning urban center were simply beyond the means of the small community that remained. Why rebuild a colossal cathedral when the trade that funded it had vanished decades earlier? Why repair miles of defensive walls when no empire coveted this broken place? The earthquake revealed a harsh truth that the city's grandeur was not just a memory but a physical burden. The very stones that had defined its glory now lay as an insurmountable obstacle to its recovery. This event accelerated Ani's transformation from a living, if diminished, town into a true ghost city. It provided the final, physical breaking point. In the years that followed, the remaining population gradually drifted away to more stable ground, leaving the skeletons of churches and palaces to the wind and grazing sheep. The crossroads fell silent, not with a bang, but with a deep, seismic shudder that settled into a permanent quiet. The ruins we see today, frozen in their dramatic collapse, are largely in the posture they assumed in that terrible year, making the 1319 earthquake not the cause of Ani's decline, but the period at the end of its long and complex sentence. The silence that followed the earthquake was not an immediate emptiness, but a slow, deepening quiet. For nearly 400 years, from the 14th to the 17th centuries, Ani did not vanish so much as it diminished, grain by grain, like a great sandcastle succumbing to a gentle but persistent tide. The grand metropolis that once housed 100,000 souls gradually contracted into a small, struggling village clinging to the ruins. Families moved out of the damaged, cavernous shells of stone mansions and built simpler, smaller homes from scavenged bricks within the shelter of the still-standing walls. Life retreated into the city's bones, using the cathedral's nave as a seasonal shelter for animals, or a church's sturdy crypt as a storage cellar. The wide, straight avenues designed for Silk Road caravans grew quiet, their stones gradually buried under wind-blown soil and encroaching grass. This was not a dramatic exodus, but a generational retreat, a community growing smaller and more insular as the world beyond the cliffs changed irrevocably. This process of abandonment is a masterclass in the death of a city, and it reveals three powerful, interconnected forces. First, and most decisively, was the collapse of the very reason for Ani's existence, the Silk Road. The old, stable networks that had funneled wealth through this specific pass were shattered. New maritime routes were opening, with ships carrying spices and silks across the Indian Ocean and into the Mediterranean, bypassing the arduous and now politically fractured overland journey across Anatolia and the Caucasus. The caravans that did still travel found different, safer paths. Ani's geography, once its greatest asset, became a liability, a remote and difficult-to-reach plateau far from the new centers of power and commerce. The economic engine had not just stalled, it had been dismantled and rebuilt elsewhere. Second, the political landscape became a patchwork of instability. The region was caught between the fading successor states of the Mongol Ilkhanate, rising Turkmen principalities, and the expanding powers of the Ottoman and Safavid empires. Ani was no longer a prized jewel to be captured and maintained, but a forgotten borderland caught in a tug of war. Without a strong, invested central authority to repair its walls, administer justice, or guarantee safe passage, there was no incentive for merchants to return or for ambitious builders to invest. The city became a place one survived in, not a place one thrived in. Finally, there was the sheer, grinding difficulty of daily life. Maintaining such a vast, exposed stone city is a monumental task even in the best of times. After the earthquake, with a shrunken population and no outside wealth, it became impossible. Leaking roofs could not be fixed, collapsing sections of wall could not be rebuilt, and clean water systems fell into disrepair. The scale of the ruins themselves became an enemy, a constant reminder of a grandeur that could no longer be supported. The community slowly realized it was caretaking a corpse. By the 17th century, the last few families likely made a pragmatic choice, moving to more manageable land in the valley below where farming was easier and shelter simpler to build. The final act of abandonment was likely not a dramatic event, but a quiet decision by a single household to not return after a winter, leaving the wind to have the last word in empty doorways. What does this slow death reveal? It shows that a city is not just a collection of buildings, but a fragile agreement between geography, economics, and human ambition. When the trade moved, the agreement was broken. Ani's fate is a powerful lesson in historical contingency, proving that even the most brilliant crossroads can be rendered obsolete by the changing currents of the world. The stones were left behind, but the life that animated them had simply flowed elsewhere, following the new paths of connection that humanity had carved across the earth and sea. For centuries, the silent city belonged only to shepherds and the wind. Then, in the 1800s, a new kind of traveler arrived at the edge of the ravine. They were European explorers, diplomats, and adventurers, armed not with swords but with sketchbooks, measuring tapes, and the newly invented camera. When they looked across the chasm at the spectral skyline of crumbling churches and towers, they did not see a forgotten provincial ruin. They saw a lost world, a medieval fairy tale frozen in stone, and they were determined to capture its fading glory. The accounts they published, filled with lush descriptions and dramatic illustrations, shocked the scholarly world. Here was an entire city of staggering architectural sophistication, unknown to Western history books, hidden in the remote highlands between empires. The explorer and archaeologist Nikolai Marr, who led the first major excavations in the early 1900s, meticulously documented structures that were on the verge of total collapse. But perhaps the most powerful tool of this rediscovery was photography. Pioneering photographers like the Russian Dmitry Ermakov set up their bulky equipment on the plateau. Their glass plate negatives captured Ani in haunting detail, the sharp contrasts of black and white emphasizing the stark beauty of arches against empty sky, of intricate carvings being slowly consumed by weeds. These images did more than record, they evoked a powerful emotion, a deep sense of melancholy and awe. They presented Ani not as a living place with a complex past, but as a sublime ruin, a monument to the inevitable passage of time and the tragic fall of civilizations. This romantic lens was seductive, but it also shaped a new narrative. For Armenian intellectuals and the diaspora, these rediscoveries struck a profound chord. Here was tangible, magnificent proof of a sovereign medieval kingdom, a golden age of art and power that countered narratives of their history as one of mere subjects or minorities. The ruins became a powerful national symbol, a source of cultural pride and a focal point for identity. The scholarly work of figures like Ma began to peel back the romantic veneer, seeking historical truth in the stratigraphy and inscriptions, but the initial wave of rediscovery had already cemented Ani's modern image. It was no longer just an abandoned city, it was a lost heritage, a ghost from a past that many were now determined to remember. This 19th century reframing reminds us that ruins are never truly silent. They wait for new eyes to give them a voice, and in that act of looking, we inevitably project our own hopes, our own nostalgia, and our own need for a story onto the stones. The romantic image of a forgotten ruin could not protect Ani from the harsh realities of the modern world. The 20th century arrived, and with it came a new and devastating layer of loss for the ancient city. Its location, once the source of its strategic power, now became its greatest curse. The border between two emerging nations was drawn directly through its heart, placing the ruins in a heavily militarized zone. For decades, Ani was not a place of study or pilgrimage, but a closed, forbidden landscape of watchtowers and barbed wire. This political freeze had immediate and tragic consequences for the stones themselves. The meticulous archaeological work begun by Nikolai Ma came to a complete halt. Without ongoing professional conservation, the elements took a heavier toll. Winter frosts cracked ancient masonry, summer storms eroded unprotected carvings, and weeds rooted themselves deep into the foundations of churches, slowly prying them apart. But the damage was not only from nature. The site's isolation and political sensitivity also made it vulnerable to less visible threats. Amateur excavations, driven by treasure hunting or local curiosity, left behind untold damage. Unrecorded digging disturbed crucial archaeological layers forever, scattering artifacts without context and destroying the very evidence needed to understand the city's daily life. In some areas, the ruins were even repurposed for military training or storage, their sacred spaces treated as mere shelters or strategic overlooks. This period of neglect and misuse reveals a painful truth about how modern conflict can reach back in time. Political disputes in the present can freeze our access to the shared past, turning a common heritage into a contested no-man's land. The evidence of 20th century damage at Ani, the unchecked erosion, the haphazard pits, the silent presence of military infrastructure, adds a profound and melancholy chapter to its story. It shows that the end of a city is not always a single event in the distant past. Sometimes the process of loss continues for centuries, as the ruins become pawns in a newer, colder game. This modern layer of silence imposed by political division meant that for generations scholars could not ask new questions of the stones, and the world was prevented from learning what they still had to say. But the story of Ani was not destined to remain frozen in that political silence. In recent decades, a quiet revolution has begun on the plateau, one that uses light and data instead of shovels. Modern archaeology has arrived, armed with tools that allow us to read the stones without ever touching them. This is a fundamental shift in our approach, moving from excavation to revelation through remote sensing. The primary tool in this new arsenal is ground-penetrating radar. Imagine a device that sends pulses of energy down into the earth and listens for the echoes. When these pulses hit something solid, a buried wall, a stone floor, the edge of a foundation, they bounce back with a different signature. By slowly dragging this unit across the grassy fields of Ani, archaeologists are creating a subterranean map of the entire city, a ghostly blueprint of what lies beneath the soil. This non-invasive technique is revealing the true scale of the metropolis in astonishing detail. It shows us the outlines of entire neighborhoods that have been completely erased from the surface, the footprints of market stalls, workshops, and ordinary homes that house the people who made the crossroads hum. We can now trace the intricate network of streets and alleys that connected these districts, understanding the flow of daily life in a way that surface ruins alone could never show. Perhaps most importantly, ground-penetrating radar is uncovering the city's hidden veins, its sophisticated water management system. It reveals the channels and cisterns that collected precious rainwater and directed it to public fountains, bathhouses, and private residences, proving that sustaining a city of 100,000 on a high, dry plateau required brilliant hydrological engineering. This technology allows us to see the phases of construction too, showing how buildings were expanded or modified over centuries, layer by invisible layer. Alongside radar, researchers are employing LiDAR, a method that uses laser pulses from aircraft to create a hyper-detailed three-dimensional model of the entire site. This digital elevation map strips away the vegetation, rendering the landscape as a pure form. It reveals subtle earthworks, the faint traces of roads leading to the city gates, and the exact topography that ancient engineers had to contend with. All of this data is then fed into powerful computers to create digital reconstructions. For the first time, we can walk through a virtual Ani, seeing the cathedral with its dome intact, watching sunlight filter through the stained glass of a church that now exists only as foundations, or observing how the city walls presented an unbroken, formidable face to the outside world. These reconstructions are not fantasy. They are hypotheses built on precise measurements and archaeological evidence, allowing historians to test theories about sightlines, acoustics, and urban planning. This modern, gentle archaeology respects the profound fragility of the site. Every time a shovel breaks the ground, it destroys context forever. By using these remote eyes, we can ask endless new questions of Ani without causing further harm. We are learning that the city was denser, more organized, and more technologically advanced than we ever guessed from its surface remains alone. Each pass of the radar unit adds another line to the story, proving that the true legacy of this crossroads is not just in the stones that stand, but in the invisible city waiting just beneath our feet, finally ready to share its secrets. Yet even as technology reveals Ani's invisible past, the ruins stand in the shadow of a modern and deeply contested present. The ancient city now finds itself at the center of a quiet, persistent conflict over memory and meaning. For many in the Armenian diaspora and the nation of Armenia, Ani is the sacred heart of a lost medieval kingdom, a powerful symbol of national identity and a poignant reminder of a homeland from which they were separated. Its image adorns stamps, artwork, and literature, a ghostly capital that represents a cultural zenith. The Turkish historical narrative, while acknowledging the site's Armenian origins, often emphasizes its later layers, framing it as part of the rich, multi-ethnic tapestry of Anatolian history under Seljuk and Ottoman rule. This divergence is not merely academic. It shapes everything from tourism brochures to conservation priorities, turning each carved stone into a potential statement. What we see here is history itself being pulled in two directions, a medieval crossroads weaponized for modern claims. The ruins become a silent witness to this struggle, their very stones used as evidence in competing stories about who owns the past. This ongoing dispute reveals a difficult truth that our understanding of history is never neutral. We look at the past through the lens of our present identities, our political needs, and our cultural longings. Ani, a place built for connection, now symbolizes division, a testament to how the stories we tell about yesterday can become battlegrounds for today. The tragedy is that this contest over legacy can sometimes overshadow the city's own more profound lesson. Its stones whisper of a time when identities were fluid, when cultures blended on a daily basis, and when a city's greatness was measured by its ability to connect worlds, not to claim sole ownership of them. In this light, the modern tension is perhaps the final, ironic layer of Ani's long story, proving that even a ghost city cannot escape the currents of the world it helped to shape. The battle for Ani's survival is now fought with steel cables and laser scans. Walk the plateau today, and you will witness this urgent race against time. In one direction, you see the hopeful signs of modern conservation. The great cathedral is embraced by a temporary forest of scaffolding, a delicate exoskeleton that allows experts to stabilize its fractured walls, stone by precious stone. Teams of archaeologists and engineers carefully clear invasive vegetation from the foundations of churches, their roots like slow, organic wedges prying apart mortar laid 1,000 years ago. These painstaking efforts represent a profound shift in thinking, an acknowledgement that these ruins are not just picturesque relics, but an irreplaceable physical archive. Every carved stone, every layer of plaster, is a page in the story of the medieval crossroads, and losing it means losing a direct line to that past. The conservation work is an act of radical listening, an attempt to preserve the stone's ability to speak, yet for every victory there is a constant, whispering threat. Primary enemy is not war or conquest, but the slow, relentless force of nature itself. The same soft volcanic tuff that made the stone so easy for medieval masons to carve now makes it tragically vulnerable to erosion. Winter after winter, freezing moisture seeps into microscopic cracks, expands as it turns to ice, and flakes away the surface, blurring intricate carvings into smooth, featureless curves. Wind scours the exposed faces of buildings, carrying abrasive dust that acts like sandpaper over centuries. Vegetation is a persistent foe, with hardy shrubs and even trees taking root in the very crevices of walls, their growth exerting a slow, hydraulic pressure that can topple entire sections. And beneath it all, the ever-present seismic risk remains, a reminder that the earthquake that shattered the city could happen again. This natural decay is a race with no finish line, a reminder that even stone has a lifespan. This ongoing struggle reveals something crucial about our relationship with history. Ani is more than a collection of old buildings. It is the last physical witness to a specific kind of world. When a carving of a Seljuk geometric pattern erodes away, we lose a tangible example of artistic exchange. When a section of wall built with Armenian techniques collapses, we lose a lesson in medieval engineering. The conservation efforts are not about freezing the ruins in time, but about preserving their capacity to teach us. It is a race to safeguard the evidence before the material proof of this interconnected medieval world crumbles into dust. Each stabilized arch, each digitally recorded inscription, is a victory in this quiet battle. It ensures that future generations will still be able to stand in this windswept place, look at the stones, and hear the echoes of 1,000 conversations from a forgotten crossroads. The fate of Ani asks us a direct question: how much of our shared human story are we willing to let quietly vanish from the earth? The ruins of Ani are more than a collection of broken churches and walls. They are a single, sprawling argument carved in stone. This argument challenges one of our most persistent historical myths, the idea that the medieval world was a collection of isolated, inward-looking civilizations. Instead, the city presents itself as a vibrant microcosm of pre-modern globalization, a place where the forces of connection were far more powerful than the forces of separation. Every layer of its archaeology tells this same story of deep and sustained interconnection. Look at the architectural fusion, where a mosque's minaret echoes a church's bell tower, and where a merchant's chapel blends Armenian, Georgian, and Byzantine artistic styles. This is not cultural confusion, it is cultural conversation, a physical dialogue between builders and patrons who are aware of traditions far beyond their own borders. The stones themselves refused to belong to just one world, they became a synthesis of many. Then, consider the artifacts scattered in the soil, the Chinese porcelain next to Persian pottery, the Byzantine coins mingled with Seljuk silver. These objects did not magically appear, they were carried by people along routes of trust and commerce that spanned continents. Each shard is a fossil of a human connection, a transaction that required shared languages of value and desire. Finally, the layered history itself, from Zoroastrian foundations to Christian cathedrals to Islamic madrasas, proves that this was a place where the world's spiritual and intellectual currents sequentially pooled and overlapped. Ani was not an exception, it was a concentrated example of a norm we have often overlooked. The medieval Silk Road was not just a path for silk and spices, it was a circulatory system for ideas, art, and faith. Cities like Ani were the vital organs in that system, places where these elements were not just traded but digested, adapted, and remade into something new. This challenges the romantic, simplified vision of hermetically sealed kingdoms. The reality was far messier and more interesting, a constant, buzzing exchange across deserts and mountains. The people of Ani lived in that reality every day. A stonemason might incorporate a pattern he saw on a Persian carpet unloaded in the bazaar. A scribe might translate a Greek text obtained from a Byzantine merchant. A ruler might adopt a military fortification technique observed from a distant empire. Their world was porous, and their city was the proof. To stand among the ruins today is to stand at the center of a vast, invisible web that once linked the markets of Constantinople to the workshops of Central Asia and the courts of the Caucasus. Ani's ultimate lesson is that isolation is often the illusion, while connection is the deeper, more enduring historical truth. Its silent stones are a powerful reminder that human cultures have always been in dialogue, borrowing, blending, and building upon one another long before the modern age gave it a name. What we witness here is not the story of a single lost kingdom, but the enduring blueprint of a connected world. This is the central paradox of the crossroads, etched into the very stones of Ani. The city stands as a breathtaking testament to cultural unity, a place where artistic styles, faiths, and languages blended into something new. Yet its historical record is equally a chronicle of division, of walls breached and sovereignties shattered. This tension is not a contradiction, but the defining heartbeat of such a place. Ani reveals that a crossroads does not choose between connection and conflict. It embodies both simultaneously, its greatness and its vulnerability springing from the exact same source. Think of it like a powerful river junction. The convergence of waters creates a fertile delta, rich with life and possibility. But that same convergence also creates treacherous currents, unpredictable floods, and a site so valuable that everyone wants to control it. Ani was that delta, the incredible synthesis we see in its architecture, the hybrid churches and adapted mosques, was made possible by the constant flow of people and ideas that its strategic position guaranteed. This was the engine of exchange, the creative force, but that very flow, that concentration of wealth and influence, is what made it a perpetual flashpoint. Its magnificent walls, therefore, tell a dual story. They were built to protect the prosperous market within, to ensure the safe passage of caravans and the orderly collection of taxes. In that sense, they were walls for commerce, defining a space of regulated interaction. Yet their sheer height, their formidable bastions, and their limited gates confess another, darker purpose. They were walls for war, designed to repel the armies inevitably drawn to the treasure they enclosed. The city's history swings like a pendulum between these two poles. For decades, even centuries, the commercial logic could prevail. Different communities found ways to live alongside one another, trading goods, intermarrying, and borrowing artistic motifs, because peace was simply better for business. The merchant Tigran Honents could build his magnificent church under Georgian rule because the economic engine was still humming, but this equilibrium was always fragile. When a powerful new empire arose or when regional tensions flared, the strategic logic of conquest would overwhelm the commercial logic of coexistence. The sack of the city, the hardship for its people, the redrawing of political maps, these were the periodic floods that swept through the delta. This paradox forces us to abandon any romantic notion of the past as either a time of pure, harmonious multiculturalism or one of endless, mindless conflict. The truth of Ani is far more nuanced and human. It shows us that people are capable of remarkable adaptation and creative fusion, building a shared life in a space of difference. But it also shows that those same people are subject to the larger tides of power, ambition, and faith that can, in a moment, redefine everything. The crossroads does not eliminate these forces, it amplifies them. It concentrates the best of human creativity and the worst of human strife in one unforgettable place. The silent ruins ask us to hold both truths in our minds at once, to see the soaring cathedral and the scar of siege in the same glance. In doing so, we begin to understand the complex, intertwined nature of history itself, where beauty and loss are often forged in the same fire. The true tragedy of Ani is not the silence of its stones, but the silence of its streets. We can measure the thickness of its walls, analyze the composition of its mortar, and trace the global origins of its shattered pottery, but these are the bones of the city. What has vanished forever is the flesh, the sound, and the breath, the intangible human tapestry that made this crossroads pulse with life. For every grand cathedral, there were 1,000 ordinary moments that left no trace. Who were the people who filled this space between empires? They were not faceless historical forces. They were individuals with hopes, routines, and stories written in the ephemeral language of daily existence. The merchant from Baghdad, unrolling a bolt of silk in the bazaar, his voice a mix of Persian and broken Armenian as he haggled with a local shopkeeper. The Armenian stonemason, his hands coated in fine white dust, teaching his son how to carve a precise geometric pattern, a skill passed down through generations that would one day decorate a Georgian-funded church. The Byzantine scholar, sitting in a sunlit corner of a scriptorium, carefully translating a Greek philosophical text, his brow furrowed in concentration as he searched for the perfect Armenian word. The Seljuk soldier, standing his watch on the mighty walls, looking out across the ravine not just as a sentry for a foreign ruler, but as a man perhaps dreaming of his family far to the east, or marveling at the strange, beautiful city he now helped to guard. The baker's daughter, weaving through crowded market lanes with a basket of fresh bread, the scent mingling with spices and animal musk, the priest preparing for evening liturgy in the cathedral, the echo of his chant bouncing off stones still warm from the sun. These were the people of the crossroads. Their lives were a constant negotiation of identity. A family might speak Armenian at home, use Greek or Arabic for trade, and adopt a Turkish style of dress that became fashionable in the markets. Their faith might be deep and personal, yet their neighbors could pray in a different direction or to different saints. This was not a theoretical multiculturalism. It was the practical reality of sharing a walled space on a high, windy plateau. Conflict and cooperation were not abstract concepts, they were lived experiences. The same communities that might clash during a political upheaval would, in times of peace, rely on each other for commerce, for skilled labor, for the simple solidarity of neighbors. The evidence we have points to this daily intertwining. The layout of the city, with its mixed residential districts, suggests people lived alongside one another, not rigidly segregated. The hybrid art and architecture could only exist if artisans from different traditions worked together, sharing techniques and aesthetic preferences. The multilingual inscriptions found on some monuments hint at a society where public messages needed to be understood by many. To reduce Ani to a chessboard of empires and trade goods is to miss its essence. The crossroads was not a geographic accident, it was a collective human achievement. It was built and maintained by countless individual choices: to travel, to trade, to adapt, to build, to worship, to stay. Each person carried within them a world of personal history, skill, and memory, and they brought it all to this singular place. When the city finally emptied, it was not just a political entity that dissolved, but a universe of these private worlds that scattered to the winds. The stones can tell us where people walked, but not the gossip they shared. They show us where they prayed, but not the content of their quiet devotions. They outline their homes, but cannot replay the sound of a child's laughter in a courtyard or the shared meal at the end of a long market day. This is the profound loss that archaeology can never recover. The ruins are a magnificent silhouette, but the living, breathing, noisy, smelly, glorious human light that once cast that shadow is gone. Remembering that light is the most important act of all, for it transforms a forgotten medieval crossroads from a historical case study into a deeply human story. These enduring stones, for all their eloquence, hold their silence on certain matters. Archaeology can map a city's skeleton, but it cannot fully resurrect its soul. We know the grand narrative of Ani, the sequence of kings and conquests, the flow of trade and the evolution of architectural styles. Yet the intimate texture of daily existence here remains just beyond our grasp, a whisper lost in the wind that now whistles through empty arches. We can excavate a merchant's home and find fragments of imported glass, but we cannot know the stories he told his children of distant cities, or the private worries he carried as political fortunes shifted. We can see the outlines of neighborhoods where different communities lived in close proximity, but the precise rhythm of their coexistence, the unrecorded friendships, the subtle tensions, the shared festivals or quiet misunderstandings, has faded into the unmarked soil. The full, vibrant spectrum of its multicultural interactions lies now only in implication, in the artistic blends and mixed currencies, not in the living voices that created them. Even the city's final act is shrouded in quiet mystery. We see the evidence of a slow, grinding decline after the Mongol disruptions and the Great Earthquake, but the last days of a living community are rarely dramatic enough to leave a clear archaeological signature. When did the final family make the decision to leave? What was the last conversation heard in the shadow of the crumbling cathedral? These are human details the stones respectfully withhold. And perhaps this is part of the site's enduring power. These unanswered questions are not failures of research, but invitations. They remind us that history is not a puzzle to be solved with all pieces neatly fitted, but a continuous conversation between the evidence we uncover and the imagination we bring to it. The gaps in Ani's story compel us to look closer, to ask new questions of old stones, and to remember that every civilization, no matter how magnificent, is ultimately made of individual lives, most of which leave only the faintest of echoes. This inherent mystery ensures that Ani is never truly a closed book. It remains an open question, a silent witness that still prompts us to wonder, to study, and to listen for the echoes of a world that connection built. Ani's ruins are a manuscript in stone, a palimpsest where each layer remains legible. You can trace the bold, confident lines of the Armenian Bagratid kingdom in the soaring vaults of the cathedral. You can read the pragmatic adaptations of the Seljuk era in the mosque that echoes a church's form. The elegant script of Georgian influence is there in the carved vines and floral patterns of later chapels. And beneath it all, the faint, older impressions of even earlier faiths and traders. This is not a single story erased and rewritten, but a cumulative text where every chapter is still visible, each contributing to a narrative far richer than any one kingdom or conquest. What these stones ultimately argue is a profound revision of the map. For too long, the medieval Caucasus and Anatolia have been cast as a distant periphery, a chaotic borderland between the so-called great civilizations of Byzantium, Persia, and the Arab caliphates. Ani refutes that. It reveals this region not as a passive edge, but as a dynamic, fiercely contested, and astonishingly creative center in its own right. This was a nucleus of innovation where architectural ideas leapt ahead of their time, where artistic styles fused into new forms, and where the theological and philosophical debates of the age were translated and debated. It was a core space of Eurasian history, a critical synapse in the neural network of the Silk Road where goods, ideas, and people from half the world were processed and transformed. To understand the medieval world as it truly was connected, interdependent, and vibrantly plural, you must look to crossroads like this one. Their very existence rewrites our textbooks, shifting our gaze from the isolated capitals to the bustling, vital spaces in between. Yet Ani's fate also speaks to the profound fragility of such hubs. Their brilliance is contingent, dependent on a delicate balance of open routes, stable politics, and a tolerance forged from necessity. When those conditions fracture, the light of the crossroads can dim with startling speed. The silent plateau stands as a monument to both the heights of human connection and the ease with which those connections can be lost. It asks us to value not just the grand monuments of history, but the fragile networks that made them possible. The story is not finished. Every act of preservation, every careful study, and every curious visitor who looks beyond the rubble to see the dialogue in the stones adds a new line to this ancient manuscript. By seeking to understand places like Ani, we do more than uncover the past. We honor the intricate, interconnected world that built it, and we ensure its lessons in creativity and coexistence are never again forgotten.